The morning was cold, and a thin layer of mist hung above the city streets. A young woman walked quickly, clutching a weather-worn violin case close to her chest as if it carried her whole world inside. Her shoes were old, the soles uneven, and her fingers slightly red from the chill, but her eyes were alive, bright, full of a quiet fire that refused to go out. Every day, she walked the same route to the cafe where she worked part-time. It wasn't a fancy place, just a small corner cafe with creaky wooden floors and the smell of coffee that never quite left your clothes. She would serve customers all morning, clean tables, wash dishes, and when her shift ended, she'd sit in the tiny park across the street and take out her violin. The violin wasn't new. It had scratches and dents, and the bow was frayed at the edges. But to her, it was more than an instrument. It was her dream, her escape, her voice. When she played, the noise of traffic and chatter faded away. The world seemed to stop and listen, even if no one actually did. Her mother used to say, "Music doesn't care if you're rich or poor. It only listens to your heart." Those words stayed with her, especially on days when life felt too heavy to carry. She didn't come from money. In fact, most people would say she came from nothing. Her father had passed away when she was little, and her mother ran a small food stall to make ends meet. There were nights when dinner was just rice and tea, but somehow her mother always smiled and said, "We still have hope." The girl's dream was simple, to become a violinist. Not famous, not rich, just good enough to make a living doing what she loved. She watched videos of great violin players on an old phone, studying their movements, their timing, their emotion. She couldn't afford lessons, so she taught herself, listening over and over until her fingers bled. One day, as she played in the park, an older man stopped to listen. He was the kind of person who carried calmness with him, a retired music teacher who had once trained orchestra students. When she finished, he smiled and asked, "Who taught you to play like that?" She blushed, unsure what to say. "No one, I just listen and practice." The man nodded thoughtfully. "You have something special," he said. "You play with your heart. Don't ever lose that." That moment changed something inside her. It was the first time someone outside her family believed in her. Every day after that, she practiced harder. She began saving every little coin she could. If she earned a few extra tips at the cafe, she didn't spend them on clothes or sweets. She saved them for strings, for rosin, for anything that could help her violin sound better. But life has a way of testing people right when they start to hope. One evening, her boss at the cafe told her about a charity event happening at a large company downtown. The company wanted to support local art programs, and they were looking for young talent to perform at their annual gala. "You should apply," her boss said. "You're really good and it could be your big break." The thought terrified her. Perform in front of rich people? In a fancy hall? She didn't even have proper shoes. But something inside whispered, "Why not?" She filled out the form, uploaded a short video of her playing, and tried not to think about it again. Weeks passed and she almost forgot about the submission, until one morning she received a message. She had been selected to perform at the event. She read the message twice, then 3 times, hardly believing it. Tears filled her eyes as she showed her mother, who hugged her tightly. "See," her mother said softly, "hard work always finds a way." The days before the event were full of nerves and excitement. She practiced before and after work, sometimes late into the night. Her bowing arm ached, but she didn't stop. She wanted to give her best. The night of the gala arrived. The venue was a tall glass building that glittered under the city lights. Inside, everything was polished: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, waiters carrying trays of sparkling drinks. She had never seen anything like it. She wore her only dress, a simple light blue one her mother had sewn years ago. It wasn't expensive, but it was clean and neat. Her shoes were still old, but she had polished them until they almost shone. She held her violin case tightly as she entered, feeling every pair of eyes on her. The performers were gathered backstage, young singers, dancers, and musicians from different backgrounds. Everyone seemed confident and elegant, chatting easily. She stood quietly in the corner, her hands trembling slightly. A few minutes before the event started, a tall man in a dark suit walked in. People whispered his name, the CEO of the company. He looked important, with sharp eyes that noticed everything. As he passed by the performers, his gaze landed on her. He frowned slightly at her worn shoes, her old violin case, and then turned to one of the organizers. "Who is she?" he asked. The organizer smiled politely. She's one of the young musicians from the community arts program. She'll be performing later tonight. The CEO raised an eyebrow. She looks like she can barely afford that violin. Are we really putting her on stage? This is a high-profile event. We can't have charity cases up there. The words cut through the air like a knife. Some of the other performers looked away awkwardly. The girl heard every word even though she pretended not to. Her face burned, but she didn't say a thing. She had learned long ago that arguing rarely changed minds. The organizer tried to defend her. Sir, she was chosen for her talent. Please trust the selection committee. But the CEO waved a dismissive hand. Talent, we'll see. Just make sure she doesn't embarrass us. Then he walked away, leaving a cold silence behind. She stood frozen for a moment, staring at the floor. The violin case felt heavier than ever. A part of her wanted to run, to leave before anyone else could look at her that way. But another part, a stronger one, whispered, No. You've worked too hard for this. She took a deep breath and sat quietly until it was her turn. She thought of her mother, of the nights she practiced in that small room, of the teacher who had told her she played with her heart. She reminded herself that this was her dream, and no one, not even a powerful CEO, could take that away from her. When her name was called, she walked onto the stage. The lights were bright and the audience looked like a sea of faces dressed in suits and gowns. Her hands trembled slightly as she set her violin under her chin. Some people in the front row whispered when they saw her. She heard faint laughter somewhere to her left. The CEO was sitting in the center, arms crossed, watching with a skeptical expression. The announcer introduced her as a self-taught musician from a local community program. A few people clapped politely. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first notes were soft, almost fragile. But as she moved through the melody, the sound grew warmer, fuller. The room began to quiet. The laughter stopped. Even the CEO leaned forward slightly. She played not just the music, but her story, the struggles, the nights of hunger, the dreams that refused to die. Every note was a piece of her heart laid bare for everyone to hear. When she finished, the final sound lingered in the air like a whisper that didn't want to fade. For a few seconds, the room was completely silent. Then one person began to clap. Another joined. Soon, the entire hall was on its feet, cheering and applauding. The girl lowered her bow, eyes wide in disbelief. She had never seen such a reaction. Among the standing crowd, even the CEO was clapping, his expression no longer cold but stunned. As she walked off stage, her hands still trembling, she felt lighter than she ever had before. She didn't know what would happen next, but in that moment, she realized something powerful. Money could buy instruments, halls, and audiences, but it could never buy the soul behind the music. And for the first time in her life, she truly believed she was enough. The applause still echoed in her ears long after she stepped off the stage. Her heart was racing so fast that she could hardly breathe. She stood behind the curtain, clutching her violin tightly, unsure if what just happened was real. People were still cheering out there, calling her back, clapping again and again. She could barely believe it, they were clapping for her. For a moment she just stood there, eyes wet, smiling to herself. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but never thought it would actually happen. She had thought maybe one person would appreciate her music, maybe two, not an entire hall filled with the city's richest people. The event organizer rushed over, almost out of breath. "That was incredible," he said, his eyes shining. "You have no idea what you just did out there. Everyone is talking about you." She didn't know what to say. All she could whisper was a soft, "Thank you." As the other performers prepared for their turn, she moved quietly to the corner, trying to calm down. She didn't want to be noticed too much. But people started coming up to her anyway. Some clapping her on the shoulder, others saying things like, "That was beautiful, and you made me cry." One older lady even handed her a handkerchief and said, "Never stop playing, dear. You have a gift." She thanked them all politely, her voice trembling each time. She wasn't used to so much attention. A little later, when the event ended, the guests moved to the main hall for dinner. Music played softly in the background, and everyone was chatting happily. She stood off to the side, holding a small glass of juice, just taking everything in. She didn't know where to stand or what to do. She felt out of place in her simple dress, surrounded by people wearing suits and glittering jewelry. Then she saw the CEO walking toward her. The same man who had doubted her earlier. The same man who had said she was too poor to play the violin. Her stomach tightened. For a moment she thought he might scold her or say something rude again. But he stopped a few steps away and looked at her in silence. His expression was different now, softer, thoughtful. After a few seconds, he said quietly, "You proved me wrong tonight." She blinked, not sure how to respond. He continued, "I've heard hundreds of musicians in my life. Most play perfectly, but what you did, it was more than skill. It felt alive." He took a small pause. "I judged you before I even heard you play. That was my mistake. I'm sorry." She didn't know what to say. No one had ever heard a CEO apologize to a poor girl before. She lowered her eyes and said softly, "It's okay, sir." He nodded. "No, it's not. People like me forget that talent and heart can come from anywhere. You reminded us of that tonight." Before leaving, he said something that stayed with her for a long time. "Keep playing. Don't let the world make you small again." That night, when she reached home, her mother was waiting at the door. She ran into her arms, and the two of them laughed and cried at the same time. She told her every detail, the applause, the people, the CEO's words. Her mother listened quietly, eyes full of tears. "I told you," her mother said softly, brushing her hair back. "Your music will take you places one day." The next morning, something unexpected happened. Her phone, which usually stayed quiet, began buzzing again and again. There were messages from people she didn't even know. Someone from the event had recorded her performance and posted it online. Overnight, it had spread like wildfire. Comments poured in, people writing things like, "I can't stop listening to this." And she plays like she's telling a story with her soul. Some even wrote, "Who is she? We need to find her." By the afternoon, local news channels were calling her an inspiration. The cafe where she worked became full of curious visitors. Her boss smiled proudly every time someone mentioned her name. But even with all the attention, she stayed humble. She still helped her mother at the food stall, still practiced in the small park every evening. She knew fame could come and go, but music, that was forever. A few days later, she received a phone call that changed everything. It was from the same company that had hosted the gala. They wanted her to come to their office for a meeting. She arrived, nervous but hopeful. The office building looked even bigger in daylight, all glass and metal shining in the sun. Inside, she was led to a large conference room. The CEO was already there, along with two other people who introduced themselves as directors of a music foundation. They invited her to sit. She did, clutching her violin case as if it were her shield. The CEO smiled this time. "We've been talking," he began, "and we'd like to help you continue your music education. Our foundation supports young talent, and we believe you deserve that chance." Her eyes widened. "You mean scholarship?" He nodded. "Yes, full sponsorship. Lessons, equipment, travel, and everything. You shouldn't have to struggle just to do what you're meant to do." She felt her heart skip. She couldn't hold back her tears as she whispered, "Thank you, sir. I don't know what to say." He replied softly, "Just promise me you'll keep playing." That promise became the start of a new chapter. She began studying under professional teachers. The first time she walked into a real music academy, she could hardly believe it was real. Clean white rooms, shelves full of instruments, the soft echo of students practicing in the distance. At first, she felt out of place again. Many of the other students came from wealthy families, dressed in expensive clothes, speaking confidently about their travels and performances. She arrived each day quietly, focused on learning. Her teachers soon noticed her dedication. She practiced longer than anyone else, staying even after class to refine her sound. One of her instructors told her, "Technique can be taught, but heart can't, and you have plenty of that." Months passed, and her skills grew sharper. Her confidence grew too. She began performing in small concerts and charity events, often playing pieces that reminded her of her humble beginnings. Each time she performed, people could feel the truth in her music. It wasn't about perfection, it was about emotion. One evening, after a small recital, a man approached her backstage. He introduced himself as a music producer who worked with orchestras around the world. "I saw your video months ago," he said, "and tonight I had to see you live. You play differently. You play like you've lived every note." He offered her a chance to audition for a traveling orchestra that was preparing for a tour across Europe. It was the kind of opportunity she had never even dared to dream about. That night, she sat by the window in her small room, holding her violin close. She looked out at the city lights and thought about how far she had come, from practicing in a noisy park to now being invited to perform on a world stage. But even in that moment of hope, she remembered where it all began. Her mother's gentle hands, the words of the old teacher in the park, and even the CEO's harsh voice that had once made her doubt herself. All of it was part of her story. The day of the audition came. She walked into the grand hall where other musicians waited, some chatting confidently, others warming up. She stayed calm, took a deep breath, and whispered to herself, "You belong here." When her turn came, she walked to the center of the stage. The judges looked serious, holding their pens ready. She placed the violin under her chin, closed her eyes, and began to play. This time the music was not just about struggle, it was about gratitude. Every note carried the weight of her past, but also the brightness of her future. She thought of her mother listening at home, of the CEO who believed in her now, of the people who had cheered for her the first night. When she finished, the room was silent again, just like that first gala night. Then one of the judges said quietly, "Beautiful." A few days later, she got the call. She had been accepted. She ran to her mother's food stall, tears streaming down her face, laughing and crying at once. Her mother dropped everything and hugged her tightly. Neither of them spoke for a long time. They didn't need to. The music had already said it all. That evening, she played her violin once more in the park where everything had started. The same spot, the same sky, but this time her sound reached farther than ever. Children stopped to listen, people smiled as they passed by, and the city seemed to hum along with her melody. She had once been the girl everyone overlooked, the one who was too poor to play. But now, her music had become a voice for everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. And though her journey was just beginning, she finally understood that she didn't need riches or approval, only courage, and a violin that still carried her dreams. The sound of the train wheels clicking against the tracks filled the air as she stared out of the window. Her violin case rested on her lap, and the sunlight flickered across her face. She still couldn't believe she was on her way to join a real orchestra. Every time she looked at the ticket in her hand, it felt like a dream that might vanish if she blinked too long. Her mother had waved goodbye at the station that morning, smiling through her tears. She had packed her some food and whispered, "Go make them hear you. I'll be listening from here." Those words kept echoing in her mind. The journey was long, but her heart was light. When she finally reached the city where the orchestra was based, she stepped out into a world that felt both exciting and overwhelming. Tall buildings, busy streets, people rushing everywhere. It was so different from her small neighborhood. She looked around, trying to take everything in. At the academy where the orchestra members trained, she was greeted by a coordinator who showed her around. The rehearsal hall was huge, with polished wooden floors and rows of chairs arranged neatly around the conductor's stand. The air smelled faintly of varnish and music sheets. When she first entered the hall, the sound of instruments tuning filled her ears, violins, cellos, flutes, clarinets, all blending into a warm, chaotic harmony. It was beautiful and intimidating at the same time. She felt a lump in her throat. The conductor, an older man with kind eyes and a calm voice, welcomed her. "We are happy to have you," he said. "Here we work hard, but we play with heart. I've heard about your story. You'll do fine." Those words gave her courage. But when the rehearsal started, she realized just how high the standards were. The music pieces were complex, with fast rhythms and sudden changes. Everyone around her seemed confident, their instruments shining, their movements precise. At first, she struggled to keep up. During one rehearsal, she missed a few notes, and the violinist next to her glanced sideways with a small frown. She pretended not to notice, but her cheeks burned. After practice, she stayed behind alone, playing the same passages again and again until the janitor turned off the lights. Days passed like that. Long hours of practice, sore fingers, and quiet dinners alone in her small apartment. But she didn't complain. She reminded herself that this was what she had dreamed of. The road to dreams was never easy. One evening after everyone left, she was practicing alone when the conductor walked in. He listened silently for a while, then said, "You remind me of myself when I was young, always the last to leave, always trying to be better. But don't forget, music isn't about being perfect. It's about being true." He handed her a small piece of paper. Here's a solo piece we'll be performing in 2 weeks. I want you to play it." Her eyes widened. "Me, but I'm new here," he smiled. "Yes, but you play with something the others sometimes forget. Feeling. That's what the audience remembers." When he left, she sat on the stage for a long time holding the paper, heart pounding. A solo, her very own solo. It felt both terrifying and wonderful. From that day, she practiced even harder. She woke up early, played before breakfast, and rehearsed late into the night. The piece was delicate and emotional, full of soft notes that rose and fell like waves. She poured everything she had into it. Her past, her mother's love, her struggles, her gratitude. But not everyone was happy about her opportunity. A few members of the orchestra whispered behind her back, "She's new and she already got a solo? That's not fair," one said. Another replied, "She only got it because people feel sorry for her." She heard their whispers one evening as she was packing her things. It hurt, it always did, but she tried not to show it. Instead of arguing, she walked home quietly and practiced even more. She wanted her music to answer for her. The night of the concert came sooner than she expected. The hall was packed and the lights were bright. Her hands trembled slightly as she waited backstage. She could hear the murmur of the audience, the rustle of programs, the soft coughs before silence fell. The orchestra began the performance with grand pieces, and everything sounded perfect. When it was time for her solo, the conductor looked at her and gave a small nod. She stepped forward, heart thudding in her chest. The moment she lifted her violin, the noise of the world disappeared. She closed her eyes and began to play. The first note floated through the air like a whisper, gentle but sure. The melody rose slowly, filled with warmth and longing. Each stroke of her bow carried a piece of her journey. The cafe, the park, her mother's laughter, the CEO's words. Every sleepless night, the audience leaned in, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. The music wasn't just sound, it was emotion made visible. When she finished, there was a moment of deep silence. Then a wave of applause rolled through the hall. People stood clapping and cheering. Some even shouted her name. The conductor smiled proudly and gave a small bow toward her. She could hardly move. Tears blurred her vision as she lowered her violin. The other orchestra members, even the ones who had doubted her, smiled and patted her shoulder. After the concert, a group of people came backstage to meet her. Journalists, sponsors, even a few students who said she had inspired them to start learning music. She thanked them shyly, trying not to cry again. That night she called her mother. The moment her mother answered, she said, "They stood up, Mama, they stood up for me." Her mother laughed through tears. "Of course they did. You've been standing tall for years and they're just catching up." In the following weeks, life began to change faster than she could imagine. She was invited to perform in other cities. Interviews, small TV features, newspaper stories. No, everyone wanted to hear her journey. But she never let fame get to her head. She still carried her old violin case, the one that had scratches and faded paint, because it reminded her of where she began once. During an interview, a reporter asked, "What's the secret behind your success?" She smiled and said simply, "There's no secret. Just don't stop believing when others do." Even though things were going well, she sometimes felt lonely. Traveling constantly, staying in hotels, moving from one stage to another. It was exciting, but it also meant being away from home. Whenever she felt homesick, she took out her phone and called her mother. Sometimes they didn't talk much, just listened to each other's breathing while the violin rested beside her. One day, she received an invitation to perform in the same city where the first gala had happened, the place where it all began. The letter said the company was holding another charity event and wanted her as the guest performer. When she read it, she felt her heart swell with emotion. It had been almost 2 years since that night. She wondered if the CEO still remembered her. She accepted the invitation without a second thought. The evening of the event arrived. As she stepped into the same grand hall, memories came rushing back. The cold looks, the nervousness, the trembling hands. But this time she walked with her head held high. People greeted her warmly, and her name was printed in gold letters on the program. When she went backstage, she saw the CEO waiting there. He looked older, a few more gray strands in his hair, but his smile was genuine. "I knew you'd come back here someday," he said softly. "You proved something that night, not just to me, but to everyone who ever doubted someone for their background." She smiled. "You helped me too, sir. Without that night, maybe I wouldn't have found my courage." He shook his head. No, you already had courage. I just happened to witness it. When she performed that night, her music filled the hall again, only this time it was brighter, lighter, full of joy instead of pain. The same audience that once looked at her with pity now looked at her with admiration. After the show, as she stood outside under the city lights, she realized how much had changed. The world around her was the same, but she wasn't. She had learned that dreams don't belong only to the rich or lucky. They belong to those who keep playing even when no one listens. As she walked home that night, she smiled to herself. She wasn't just a poor girl with a violin anymore. She was a voice that spoke for everyone who had ever been told they couldn't. And deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning of her music's journey. The sound of applause had become familiar now. Every city she visited, every stage she performed on, the clapping was the same. Loud, full of admiration, echoing through the hall like waves. Yet inside her, something was changing. She had dreamed of this life for so long, but living it was not as easy as she once imagined. After her return performance at the company's charity gala, her popularity grew faster than she could keep up with. Her videos went viral again. Newspapers called her the miracle violinist. Music schools invited her to give speeches. Sponsors reached out, offering her contracts, new instruments, and expensive gifts. She was traveling constantly, one week in Paris, another in Tokyo, then in New York. At first, she felt grateful for every moment. She had never seen so much of the world. The bright lights, the elegant hotels, the cameras flashing, everything was exciting. But over time, she started noticing how lonely it could be. Everywhere she went, people recognized her. Strangers wanted pictures, fans asked for autographs. They spoke about how lucky she was, how glamorous her life seemed. But no one saw the long nights, the homesickness, or the quiet tears she wiped away when she missed her mother. She kept in touch with her mother through video calls, though the time zones often made it hard. Sometimes she'd call late at night after a concert and her mother would still be awake, waiting. "Did you eat properly?" her mother would ask. "You look tired." She would smile and say, "I'm fine, Mama, don't worry." But the truth was, she hadn't been sleeping well. She practiced endlessly, worried about making mistakes, about disappointing the people who now expected perfection from her. Her manager, a kind but busy woman, always reminded her, "You have to keep your schedule full. The world wants to see you now, don't let the attention fade." So she said yes to everything, more shows, more interviews, more recordings. Slowly, the joy she once felt when she played began to fade. The violin, which had once been her voice, now felt like a job. One evening, after a long rehearsal, she sat alone in her hotel room. The city lights sparkled outside, but she didn't feel their warmth. Her hands ached and her mind was heavy. She placed her violin on the table and stared at it. She whispered to herself, "Why does it feel so different now?" The next morning, her manager called to remind her about a press conference. She nodded quietly, put on her best smile, and went. Cameras flashed as soon as she entered the room. Reporters shouted questions about her next tour, about rumors, about luxury brands she was endorsing. In the middle of it all, one reporter asked, "Do you still play for yourself? Or only for your audience now?" The question hit her harder than she expected. For a moment, she didn't know how to answer. She smiled faintly and said, "I play because music is part of me." But inside, she wondered if that was still true. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay awake, thinking about her younger self. The girl who played in the park with an old violin, who didn't have shoes that matched, who played for the joy of hearing her own music. She missed that girl. She missed that freedom. A few days later, she traveled back to her home city for a brief rest between tours. Her mother greeted her with open arms, just like always. The familiar smell of home, cooked food, fresh tea, and warmth made her eyes fill with tears. "You've lost weight," her mother said, touching her cheek gently. "You've been working too much," she smiled. "It's just been busy, that's all." But her mother could see through her smile. That evening, they sat outside the small house listening to the street sounds. The sky was full of stars and a gentle breeze carried the smell of food stalls nearby. Her mother said quietly, "You used to play even when no one was watching. Remember, you played for yourself. Maybe you should do that again." She looked down, her throat tightening. "I don't even know if I remember how." Her mother reached for her hand and squeezed it. "Then start small. Play for me, so she did. Right there, under the open sky, she took out her violin and began to play softly. The notes floated into the night, gentle and full of love. It wasn't a grand performance, it was just a daughter playing for her mother. When she finished, her mother smiled and said, "See, that's what your music was missing. Peace." The next morning, she decided to visit the small park where she used to practice years ago. It looked almost the same. The same benches, the same tall trees, even a few children running around just like before. She sat on the same spot and took out her violin. People walking by slowed down to listen. Some recognized her and whispered, surprised to see her there. But she didn't care. For the first time in a long time, she played without lights, without cameras, without pressure. Just her and the violin. When she finished, a little girl approached her shyly and said, "I want to play like you someday." She smiled warmly. "Then start now. Don't wait for anyone to give you permission." That moment reminded her why she started playing in the first place. It wasn't about fame or money, and it was about sharing something real. A few days later, she met with the CEO again. They had stayed in touch occasionally, and he often supported her charity performances. Over coffee, he said, "You've achieved everything people dream about. But tell me honestly, are you happy?" She looked out the window and sighed. "Sometimes yes, sometimes no. I love music, but I feel like I'm losing myself in the noise of success." He nodded slowly. "I understand. I once thought success was everything too. But then I realized it's only worth something if you still have peace in your heart." His words stayed with her long after their meeting. That night, she made a decision. She called her manager and said she wanted to take a short break from touring. "I need time to breathe," she explained. "I want to create something meaningful." Her manager was surprised but supportive. "You've earned it," she said. "Take the time you need." During her break, she began visiting local schools and community centers, teaching music to children who couldn't afford lessons. She recognized herself in their shy smiles and bright eyes. Some of them came with broken instruments, some with none at all, but their excitement was real. One boy asked her, "Do you think someone like me can ever be good?" She smiled and said, "I used to ask the same question. And look, we're both still learning. So yes, you can." Teaching those children brought her more happiness than any concert ever had. Every day she felt lighter, more alive. She realized that sharing her gift was just as powerful as performing on big stages. A few months later, she decided to organize a small charity concert, not for fame, but to raise funds to buy instruments for poor students. The concert was held in the same hall where her first big performance had happened. The difference was, this time she wasn't the only one on stage. She brought the children she had been teaching. They were nervous at first, but she smiled and whispered, "Just play with your heart. That's all that matters." When the music began, it wasn't perfect. Some notes were off, some bows trembled, but it was full of spirit. The audience clapped along, smiling through tears. It was real, and it was beautiful. When the concert ended, she looked around at the children, their proud faces shining with joy. She felt a deep sense of peace. She had found her purpose again. Later that night, as she walked out of the hall, one of the reporters approached her and asked, "You've played in the greatest halls in the world. How does tonight compare?" She smiled softly and said, "Tonight was the most beautiful one of all. Because I wasn't just playing for people, I was playing with them." Back at home, she placed her violin gently on the table and sat beside it. The city outside was quiet. She thought about everything, her journey from the park to the world stage, the applause, the loneliness, the rediscovery of her joy. She realized that success wasn't about fame or money. It was about connection, the invisible thread between hearts that music could create. As she closed her eyes that night, she whispered to herself, "I'm not chasing the world anymore. I'm following my heart." And for the first time in a long time, she slept peacefully, knowing that her music had finally found its true home again, not on a stage, but in the hearts of those who needed it most. The morning sun poured softly through the curtains of her small home. The air smelled of fresh tea and jasmine flowers from the window garden. The sound of birds singing outside mixed with the faint hum of city life. It had been a few years since she had stepped back from the constant touring, and her life had finally slowed down. Her days were quieter now, but they were filled with purpose. Every morning she visited the small music center she had built in her neighborhood, a place where children could learn music for free. The building wasn't fancy. It had simple white walls, a few old chairs, and instruments donated by kind people from all over the world. But for her, it was more beautiful than any grand concert hall. When she walked through those doors each day, the sound of laughter and music filled the air. Some children played violins, others learned piano or guitar. There was always a mix of sounds, and some right, some wrong, but all filled with joy. And that joy was what mattered most. The first thing she did every morning was greet the students. "Good morning, everyone," she would say, her voice cheerful. Dozens of little voices would reply, "Good morning," in unison. Then she would smile and begin the day's lessons. She had become a teacher now, not by plan, but by heart. Teaching had changed her in ways she hadn't expected. She learned patience, compassion, and how to see potential in others even when they couldn't see it themselves. Every time a student played a wrong note and frowned, she'd gently say, "Don't worry. Every wrong note is a step toward the right one." One of her favorite parts of the day was when the children performed together. They played songs she had written herself, simple tunes about hope, kindness, and dreams. Watching them, she always felt a deep warmth inside. It reminded her of her younger self, sitting in that park, trying to make her old violin sing despite the noise around her. Word about her school began to spread. Local newspapers wrote about it, calling it a place where dreams find their sound. Donors came forward to help expand the center. Soon they were able to buy more instruments, repair old ones, and offer lessons to even more children. But despite the growth, she made sure the heart of the place never changed. She told her staff, "No matter how big we become, this must always feel like home for those who have none." Sometimes the CEO who had once doubted her visited the center. Over the years, he had become one of its biggest supporters. He often stood quietly at the back of the classroom watching the children play. One day, as they listened to a small group performing, he turned to her and said, "I've attended hundreds of concerts in my life, but the happiness in this room is something no money can buy." She smiled and nodded. "That's what I've learned too. Music isn't about fame anymore. It's about connection." The years continued to pass peacefully. She performed occasionally, not on huge stages but in community events, hospitals, and schools. She would often play for people who couldn't afford concert tickets, believing that everyone deserved to experience the comfort of music. One afternoon, while she was sitting by the window at the music center, she noticed a young girl standing outside holding a broken violin. The girl looked nervous, her clothes slightly torn, her eyes unsure. She stepped outside and smiled gently. "Hi there." "What's your name?" The girl looked down and whispered, "I heard you teach music here, but I don't have money. I only have this." She held out the old violin. Its strings were missing and the wood was cracked. She took the violin carefully, studying it. It reminded her of her own instrument from years ago. The same scratches, the same tired look. She smiled softly. "Money isn't what we need here. We just need heart. Come inside." The girl's eyes lit up. She followed her inside, clutching the violin tightly. That day marked the beginning of another story, one that felt beautifully familiar. The girl practiced every day, sometimes struggling, sometimes shining. But no matter how tough it got, she never gave up. And the teacher saw herself in her. The same hunger, the same spark. She decided to guide her personally, helping her fix the violin, teaching her how to listen deeply to each sound. Months later, during a small concert at the center, that same girl stood on stage and played a piece that moved everyone to tears. The notes weren't perfect, but they were full of feeling. Afterward, the girl ran to her and said, "I did it." She hugged her tightly. "Yes, you did, and I'm proud of you." That evening, as the children left and the lights dimmed, she sat alone on one of the benches holding her old violin, the one she had carried all her life, the one that had carried her. She began to play, but not loudly, just softly to herself. The melody drifted through the room like a whisper. Each note told a part of her story. The struggles, the humiliation, the applause, the fame, the loneliness, the rediscovery of peace. It was all there, flowing gently from her fingertips. As she played, she felt her heart swell with gratitude. Every hardship she had faced had led her here, to this place, this peace, this purpose. After finishing, she looked around the empty room and smiled. "Thank you," she whispered, "to life, to music, to every moment that had shaped her. A few weeks later, she was invited to speak at a national event celebrating artists who had inspired change. She didn't like public speaking much, but she agreed. When she walked onto the stage, people stood and clapped. She smiled shyly, holding the same violin she'd always had. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but steady. "When I started," she said, "I had nothing but an old violin and a dream. People laughed at me. Some said I didn't belong, but I kept playing. Not because I wanted to prove them wrong, but because music made me feel alive." She paused for a moment and looked at the crowd. "If you ever feel like the world is too big and you are too small, just remember, it only takes one sound, one spark, one act of courage to change your life. Don't stop because others doubt you. Keep playing your own tune." The room was silent for a moment, then filled with applause that went on and on. But for her, the most meaningful sound wasn't the clapping. It was the quiet after, the peaceful silence that felt like understanding. That night when she returned home, she sat by the window, watching the moonlight fall across her violin. She smiled, thinking of how far life had taken her, from that park bench to this moment. Her journey had never been about wealth or recognition. It had always been about one thing, the power of not giving up. In the months that followed, she continued teaching, performing, and inspiring. Her students began winning competitions, getting scholarships, and starting their own journeys. Some of them even came back to teach at the same music center that had changed their lives. She often said to them, "You don't have to be famous to make a difference. Every time you make someone feel something with your music, you've already succeeded." As the years went by, her music center grew into a foundation that helped thousands of children around the country. People began calling her a legend, but she never liked that word. She'd smile and say, "I'm not a legend. I'm just someone who kept playing when the world told me not to." One evening, as she sat in the quiet hall of the center, listening to her students rehearse, she closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. The melody was full of life, laughter, and dreams, exactly what she had hoped for. She didn't need to be on stage anymore. She had already found her stage here, in the hearts of the children who would carry her music forward. When the rehearsal ended, the same young girl she had once welcomed with a broken violin came running to her, holding a certificate. "I got accepted into the music academy," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. Her eyes filled with tears as she hugged her. "I knew you would," she whispered. "You were born to play." As she watched the girl leave that evening, she felt the same joy she had felt years ago when she first touched a violin. The circle of her journey was complete, from a struggling girl who played in the park to a teacher who had helped others find their sound. The next morning, as the sun rose gently, she walked through the doors of the music center again. Children were already there, tuning instruments and chatting happily. She smiled and said, "All right, everyone, let's begin. Show me what your hearts sound like today." The room filled with music once more, bright, imperfect, and beautiful. And in that moment, she realized that her dream had never truly been about herself. It had always been about giving others the chance to dream too. The girl who was once told she was too poor to play the violin had built a world where no one would ever hear those words again. And that was her greatest masterpiece of all.